The gospel lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 23 through 32. When he entered the temple, the chief priest and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' He answered, 'I will not.' But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the second and said the same, and he answered, 'I go, sir.' But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him, and even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe in him." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I thought it would be good to preach from down here next to the table this morning. In case I was feeling hungry, I could just reach over and grab one of these nice loaves and break it. We're gathering around a table, which is a very powerful symbol, and it even takes on a richer significance and meaning as we see the variety of breads, and the wheat is on the table as well. We're reminded that symbols have been in the news a lot recently over the past few weeks. The power and meaning of symbols and images. The symbol of the flag. The symbol of someone kneeling in protest. Images of devastation in Puerto Rico, the other islands of the Caribbean. Images of buildings crumbled in Mexico City. We're reminded of how those images and how those symbols can move us and grab us. And we find ourselves engaged in conflict and argument, or with a deep desire to be able to reach out and do something to help people. Symbols are powerful. They're significant. They work to transform us, to give us some guidance, to give us a pattern, a way forward into acting in the midst of life around us. Helen and I had the good fortune of going to hear Thomas Friedman this past week at Lake Highland School. Friedman is a New York Times columnist and best-selling author, and he was speaking a lot about his most recent book, "Thank You for Being Late," is the title of the book. And it has to do with the significance of power of the rapidity of technological innovation in our lives in the world, especially in the last 10 years. From 2007, he named a number of the events technologically and companies that began in 2007, which had just fundamentally changed the way we go about our daily lives. And he said that he thought the significance of this rapidity of change and the way it's just exploding exponentially is it's put us once again at a time in human history where one person has the power by pushing a series of buttons to destroy the world, but also at a period of time where one person, through the power of the internet and technology that takes place across the internet, can do something that fundamentally changes the world for good. Friedman said, we're kind of at this crossroads of power, which can be so wonderful for us, but also very dangerous. And he said that we need an image. We need an image to help us get through and find our way in the midst of this crossword. And the image he suggested was thinking about a hurricane and the forces of winds that are circulating in a hurricane. He may have been using this image in light of the fact that many of us had passed through a hurricane recently. But he said, think about the winds and how they form a circle and how they form a wall, and all of that chaos is caught up in the wall, the interior wall of the hurricane. But yet in the middle of that hurricane, there's an eye where there is calm and where communities can work together and act together. And he went on to suggest that he thought the image we need to hold in our minds was this eye of a hurricane. And as communities, we needed to find an eye that preserved some sense of peacefulness and unity and trust. And that was the image he held out as a way for us, trying to make our way in the midst of such humongous change. But we're Christians, and we have another image. We have the image of this table. We have the symbol of this table. What power does it have over us as we gather here this morning? Think about a table. There are all kinds of images around tables, aren't they? What do we call? We have times tables that we learned when we were children. We have tax tables that are supposed to be on the back of your IRS forms that you can figure out your tax. In parliamentary procedure, we table a motion, and that sort of removes the item of discussion completely from the discussion of the group. The power of the table is to just move it off. And sometimes if you go into a popular restaurant and certain people are sitting, where are they sitting? They're sitting at the power table, right? And they're having a power lunch or a power dinner. So tables in and of themselves seem to have a symbolic significance to us. And if you watch the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War this past 2 weeks, you saw one of the episodes where he recounted how the peace talks began in Paris. But they began in the midst of great difficulty because there was disagreement about the table that they would sit at and who was going to sit where at the table. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong wanted a table that was square so that there would be equal sides for each representative from the various countries to sit around the table. And there was disagreement from the South Vietnamese and the United States because they didn't want to extend that kind of recognition to everybody. And the peace talks almost completely different. It didn't happen because they couldn't decide on the shape of the table. And it was the Russians who suggested having a round table where everybody could sit together, that opened the way for the countries to come together and begin to have a peace talks. The symbol and the power of a table is so deeply ingrained in us. I remember as a child, the table that we sat around to have family meals. How many of you can remember the table in your childhood homes, or even the table in your grandparents' homes? I can remember the table in my grandparents' home. But I remember our family table because for whatever reason it sticks out in my mind that when we moved from one home to another home, the eating area was a little different, and so it called for us to get a new table. And so Mom and Dad researched, and they found a round oak table for sale that we all went out and bought together one evening. And it just seemed to be a huge event for us. We'd always had a square table, but now we were going to have a round table. And it was a solid oak table. And that seemed to, I can remember going and buying and picking up that table. and then gathering around it as a family. We kept that table all while I was growing up, and the table then was in my mom and dad's home when they lived up in Longwood there for many years. But at some point, the table started to break down and got rickety, and so they bought another round table because having a round table had just become the way of things in our family. But that first table, which was so dear and important to me, maybe to others as well, was put out on the porch to just kind of sit there, and on occasions when we would gather in a large family setting, maybe some would go out and sit on that porch table and around it, but it got kind of mildewy out there and wasn't used all that often. So that when the time came after my mom and dad had moved and we were having the yard sale, we went out there to check on that old table and moved it, and it practically just dissolved into ashes there on the porch. The insects and the termites have been working at it as nobody sat around it. And I began to realize, a table just doesn't have much life left in it if there aren't people sitting around it, gathering around it, eating together, does it? That's true of this table. But whether it's square or rectangular or round isn't really what is most significant for us as Christians as we gather at this table. What is most significant for us in both its symbolism and its imagery is the person, the presence, the life that we come and find ourselves engaged with as we gather around this table. Even as we remember the grandparents and parents and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and friends that we engaged with around our family tables. When we come to this table as Christians, what is significant for us at this table is the presence of the person who invites us here and the actions of the person who meets us here and the life of the person which is offered to us here. And that person being Jesus Christ. Matthew reminds us what's fairly significant about this person. Matthew says that this person's words and actions meet up together. Like the son who recognized a better thought and went out and did what he initially said he wouldn't do, in contrast to the son who said, I'll go, but never went. Words and actions didn't meet up, as the story of Matthew seems to suggest was true of the Pharisees and religious leaders who were questioning Jesus' authority. But at the end of the passage, it seems to suggest that Jesus' authority is based on the reality that his words and his actions match up. They go together, and in going together, they reveal the truth about the righteousness of God at work in the world, where the broken are healed, where they come together, those who are lost and included, where those who feel unclean are cleansed, where those who feel broken are made whole. The words and actions of Jesus go together and reveal the new righteousness. That's the presence that we meet here at this table. And as Paul reminds us, it's a presence which sometimes seems to us very different from the nature and reality of the world, because the presence that we meet at this table is one in which greatness is clothed in weakness, where the one who was in the form of God took on the form of a servant, where the one who was exalted became obedient even to the point of death on the cross. Something amazing happens at this table. It isn't just that we come empty and feel filled up as we eat here. We come offering and recognizing and acknowledging our need and receive an answer for who we are to be. An answer in the presence of the person who meets us here and offers us this bread and this cup and his life as a way for us to reorient our lives as we seek to live in the world. Power in the image and the symbolism and the way of the table. Some of the elders are going to take communion this afternoon to people who can't be present with us, members of our congregation, but who can't be present with us to share in this meal. We're going to be taking this meal to them. And as we review the appropriate policies in the Book of Order and the Directory of Worship for doing that, it became interestingly clear to us that what we were doing in that act was not going out and serving a whole new kind of communion. What we were doing was extending the table. And so we are in reality taking the bread and taking the juice from this table, taking the community that is gathered around this table and extending it out these doors into the areas where they live, even as though we were laying one table end to end to end to end to end until this table went all the way out into their lives throughout the world. That's what we're doing, extending the table. Some of you may have seen a commercial on TV that I find that represents this idea very powerfully, symbolically. It's a commercial sponsored by a company called President's Choice, which is part of a larger food conglomeration in Canada. And they put together this commercial to celebrate Canada's 150th anniversary this year. And the commercial is called #EatTogether. And it begins with a young woman after a long day of work making her way into her apartment building. But even as she does, comes into the apartment building with others around her. Everyone is on their digital device, on their phone, has earplugs plugged in. Nobody is recognizing or acknowledging anybody else as they kind of shove into each other through the door. She walks up to the doorman. He's doing the same thing, never looks up to speak to her or say. And you can just feel this woman bearing that weight of being disconnected to everybody. They all make their way into the elevator, nobody acknowledging each other. Eventually the elevator doors open and they all scatter to the various apartments. She walks into her own apartment and her roommate is sitting there on the computer with headphones on, and she holds her satchel, drops it on the floor, and her roommate never looks up. Complete disconnect in the midst of what we say so often connects us together. And so the next thing you see is this young woman dragging her roommate and taking the table from their apartment and putting it into the hallway of the apartment building where they live, and then putting some food on the table and putting their chairs around it with some extra chairs. And then the next thing you see is another young family start to come out their doors, and they look down the hallway. What in the world are they doing? But they invite him, come join us. And so the mother and father with their little child go in and bring their table out of their apartment, put it down, and begin to sit down. And sooner than you can realize, everyone is coming out of their apartments and putting their tables down, filling up that whole hallway, going from end to end. The table being extended, family after family, gathering, being connected, beginning to live out a new way with each other, extending the table. And then the commercial ends with a little girl climbing underneath the table in the midst of everybody's legs. She comes out at the very end, runs down the hallway, knocks on the last door, and then an elderly gentleman opens it up and looks out and sees what's going on, and he kind of jumps back inside, and the little girl stands there. What's going on? All while Dionne Warwick sings, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." Just so powerful, so moving. The little girl raises her hands like, what's he doing? And then he comes out. He'd gone back inside. He grabs a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread, and he comes to join them at the table and extend the table. So powerful. I posted it on Facebook so others could see it. And then my brother texted me and said, "Did that last gentleman bring a bologna to the table?" I said, "No, it was a bottle of wine and bread. Bottle of wine and bread. Don't you get the imagery? Don't you get the imagery? Are you crazy?" He said, "Okay, I'll take your interpretation of it." So I went back and looked at it again and again, and sure enough, that gentleman brings a bottle of wine and what I think now is a big bologna to the table. So be it. So be it. It's the bread and the wine that we're extending this morning. Here together and out that door and into the world, extending it so that this mind of Christ will be amongst all of us. If we just gather around this table and then walk out the door and leave it here, we'll be just like that brother who said, "Sure, I'll go," and never did. Amen.